Yes, we are back for episode number 10 of the Shutdown Inning podcast. I am Steven Rissotto. Tyler Hall is here too. Tyler, happy New Year. How you doing? Welcome
Hey,
again.
everybody. Happy New Year. Yeah, first episode of the year. I hope you had a great holiday, Stephen. And yeah, doing great over here. I guess let's keep the pleasantries to a minimum because we have a very special guest with us today.
Yes, we do. Very special guest. He's covered baseball for a very long time. He is currently the senior writer for Sportico.com. And very importantly, he's a Hall of Fame voter since 1992. It is Mr. Barry Bloom. He joins the show. Barry, how you doing? Welcome. Happy New Year.
Yeah, thanks. I'm not sure if we're past that Larry David date where you're not supposed to say Happy New Year anymore. It's like 2 weeks after the New Year's. That's it. So, but Happy New Year since it's your first show.
Yeah, the Christmas tree actually just went out yesterday. And all the stuff's down, so we're all good. I guess we could start, getting back to realism here and outside the holidays. But no, we wanted to have you on because the Hall of Fame announcement is coming up 2 weeks from Tuesday. It's of course a big day in baseball. I think for me, it's one of the main storylines of every winter. Kind of hearing the debate that goes back and forth. And Tyler and I are just so consumed with all the conversation. But we wanted to ask first and foremost. I mentioned 1992 was the first time you voted. Do you remember that first ballot that you got in the mail and the first time filling it out and what it felt like?
Sure, it was obviously a huge thrill. It really, just so people understand, you have to be a baseball writer with the Baseball Writers Association of America in good standing for 10 consecutive seasons to qualify to be a Hall of Fame voter. And so, it was after my 10th season. It was 1992. I got my first card, I think, in 1983, down in San Diego. I was down in San Diego covering the Padres. So the ballot itself, that was, Tom Seaver, Raleigh Fingers, who were, both elected uh, because of the Fingers connection with the Padres. They sent me to Cooperstown. That was my first induction ceremony, uh, and it was it was quite a thrill.
Were you expecting it? Did you know it was coming or around when it would show up, or were you just checking your mail one day and opened it up and the golden ticket was in there?
No, no, no. You basically, once you have the 10 years in, you know, you, they usually, it's not usually a surprise that you get a ballot, and the
Hmm.
ballot doesn't come in a. I don't remember back in 1992 what the ballot envelope looked like. I mean, now it's pretty prescribed. I mean, it's got a stamp on it with a number that you're given. Your ballot number 28 or something like that,
Hmm.
and then you have to file it in a particular envelope that they give you. It's still all old school. It's not online. It's all done handwritten. You have to sign
Yeah.
it, put your baseball writer card number in, and then and fill out the boxes that indicate you want to guys you want to vote for anywhere from like 0 to 10.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I knew the ballot was coming, so it really wasn't a surprise when it was in the mail and it got there.
Yeah.
Today it's a little different because we've had some controversy with the Hall of Fame voting. We had the idiot Dan Lebitard a number of years ago, and I say that lovingly because Dan's a good old friend of mine, but it was not a smart thing that he did, giving the ballot. I think it was to Deadspin, so they could vote in his name. And when
Hmm.
that all was publicized, it became a huge brouhaha. And now the Hall of Fame basically makes you apply for your vote every year to make sure
Wow.
that you're legitimate, and they give you a lot of admonitions on that ballot, basically saying what you can and you can't do if you accept the vote. And if you basically do something like that now, you can lose your vote forever. I'm not sure what they did with Lebitard. I know he lost it for at least a year, but I'm not sure whether or not he's ever voted again.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. And I wanted to ask because, like, the recent years, I guess the last maybe 8 years, we've had the ballot tracker, which is a whole thing by a Twitter user, Ryan Thibodeau, who's awesome. He's really good at this tracker and keeping track of the people that vote and where they're trending. Every time a ballot gets tweeted out, he automatically puts it in the tracker. Him and his whole crew, they do a great job. Is it, do you like it that way? Do you like hearing out kind of like, how guys are doing on the ballot, or are you more of the element of wanting the surprise? Or I guess I should rephrase that. Do you like the element of surprise come announcement time, or do you like it the other way, kind of the new way of how, looking at guys trending upwards and looking how Scott Rolen is doing, looking at how Andy Pettit's doing, or do you like that surprise when the announcement comes out?
I'm of two minds of it. First of all, very early on, I started writing columns and publishing my ballot on Twitter. I just thought it was an important thing to be transparent about it. There's no hiding it. I mean, based on the rules of the Hall of Fame, the ballots can be anonymous, and I've had this discussion recently, countering back and forth that the guy who didn't vote for Derek Jeter should have to explain himself. It shouldn't be a mystery who didn't vote for Derek Jeter. If you decided not to do it, then own up to it and say, this is why I didn't do it, and let's all move on, and don't infringe on a number of other people and keep people guessing about who it might be or who it might not be. But on the other hand, I think, and I love Ryan and what he's done, but I'm a little circumspect that I think we should all be transparent about our ballots, but I'm not sure now if it should be after the vote. That we shouldn't be transmitting our votes and beforehand. Now there's really no rules against it. Everybody's going to do what they're going to do. Last year I had what I thought was a pretty highly controversial ballot, and so I decided not to release my ballot till the day of the vote. The day Ortiz was announced, I wrote a column and published my ballot. I just didn't see any sort of value in publishing that ballot early, although I was perfectly willing to have my all steroid ballot scrutinized and Kurt Schilling ballot all scrutinized, but not beforehand. I didn't want the fuss of it beforehand. But this year I did what I usually do, and when I mail my ballot, I write my column. Uh, it's usually one of the most highly read columns of the year, and I get more responses on it. I've had some really good back and forths with people on social media, various forms of social media, about who I vote for and who I don't vote for. And some people have been, they start off with, you're an idiot, and you shouldn't have your vote. You should be stripped of your vote. And I always laugh about that. I'm never going to be stripped of my vote. It's my vote. But so, because I didn't vote the way you wanted me to vote, I'm going to be stripped of my vote. Well, no, that's not the point. But I think when you get through all that, I've had good conversations with people about re-examining my stance on some guys who I ultimately voted for on ballots when I didn't vote for them before. Jeff Bagwell is a perfect example. And I really felt, until Steve Garvey got into the Hall of Fame, Jeff Bagwell doesn't deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. But then I looked at, Bagwell's numbers and what he did, and it really was a specious argument. Just because Garvey wasn't in didn't mean I shouldn't vote for Bagwell. And I wound up the next year, and until he got in, voting for Bagwell. But there are other guys, like I've had on running arguments. Right now, the most notorious of them are Andrew Jones and Billy Wagner. And I gave both of them a really close look again this year. I spent a lot of time in analyzing, using some current metrics as opposed to using the counting career metrics, which I've always used. And I'm not a big WAR guy, but it's used in contract negotiations now, so there's no purpose in not citing it. And Wagner's WAR and his save level just doesn't compute to being in the Hall of Fame. I mean, John Franco is right there. He as a left-handed reliever, John Franco's got 2 more saves. Is Billy Wagner the best left-hander of all time? Well, I think you'd have an argument with that from people who covered and knew John Franco. And John Franco didn't stay on our ballot very long. So no Billy Wagner. And the same with Andrew Jones. I mean, you get the argument from all the metric guys about his 10 home runs and his 400 some odd homers and blah, 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 blah. But then you come down to it and his slash line is awful. Career slash line is awful. He's a 252 lifetime hitter. And, and I still think batting average is a real gauge of how good a player is. It's a component of all those other figures. On base percentage, slugging percentage, OPS, batting average, and the hits you get are part of the equation. So you can't totally negate batting average, but you can't use it in exclusivity anymore either. Mm-hmm. But I'm sorry, a 250 batting average doesn't get you into the Hall of Fame. And then the fact is, I watched him eat his way out of the league, and his last 5 years, from 30 to 35, he wasn't old, and he just ate himself out of the league, and his numbers were horrible. I talked to Ned Colletti, who was the general manager of the Dodgers back in the day, and he said he was the worst free agent signing he ever made. And and he batted 150 for the Dodgers before they finally had to restructure his contract so they could release him and pay him off over time. That's not a Hall of Famer as far as I'm concerned. So no Andrew Jones, but it's a very interesting basically exercise every year. And like I think most of my colleagues and cohorts who have the vote, there's about 400 of us, maybe a little less at this point. I think I take it very seriously every year. It's one of the most serious things I do. And I'm very critical of it. As you saw in my column this year, I said this is the worst ballot I've ever seen in all the years I've voted. And I stand by that. I thought about not doing a blank ballot this year because I just don't think anybody belongs in the Hall of Fame on that ballot. And some of them who are marginal or should be in are touched by, the steroid era, of which I've never been at issue with. I've always voted for steroid candidates, but it still infringes on their ability to get into the Hall of Fame. And to a certain extent, since they're not going to be widespread voted for, they're kind of a wasted vote at this point.
Yeah. You brought up PEDs quite a bit there in the whole steroid era. What were your thoughts during the era, kind of before some of these guys hit the ballot? Your Bonds, your Clemens, your Pudges, to name a few. And then, we talked a little bit right before we recorded. I'm a Giants fan myself. A lot of our listeners are, so I'd have to ask you, almost specifically on Barry Bonds' candidacy or lack thereof now, since he's not even a candidate, and kind of your thoughts on him being held out, and will he ever see Cooperstown?
During this steroid era, my feeling about it was that people loved the era. It was a home run hitting, very competitive era that was filled with great players who people suspected of doing steroids or people didn't. But, we voted in 23 players from that era. There's not going to be 23 players in the next 2 generations of players who are going to get into the Hall of Fame from this era or the coming era. It was just an era chocked with so much talent, and it was a fun era to watch. And I always thought that not one person didn't buy tickets because they thought a guy was doing steroids. In fact, I think they might have bought tickets because they thought he was doing steroids, because it was fun to come to the ballpark and watch them hit the ball, humongous distances. And there had to be some sort of an excuse for it. My ultimate moment of the steroid era was, when Bonds, faced Eric, the left hand
Yeah.
pitcher from
Eric
the
Gagne.
right, and it's like, and basically told Gagne, throw me your best fastball, and it'll be me against you, and we'll see what happens. And it was a 3-1 game in San Francisco, and Bonds came up against Gagne in the late innings, and essentially Gagne threw him fastballs, hit one foul a mile, and then tried to sneak a slider by him, and he hit it in the bay. To me, that was a guy who admitted doing steroids pitching, a guy everybody suspected of doing steroids hitting, and that was the outcome. Barry is the best, among the top 3 baseball players that I've ever seen play. My top 3 hitters are, growing up in New York. This is nothing against Willie Mays, because I just didn't see him that much, either on TV or live. He was out in San Francisco by the time I was old enough to watch the game. I did not see him as a kid in the Polo Grounds, but but I did see Mantle every day from like the late 50s till the end of his career, and he's the top power hitter I've ever seen. The guy could do more from both sides of the plate than anybody I've ever seen. So it was him, Tony Gwynn, who I covered almost every day in San Diego, and then Barry, who turned himself into Tony Gwynn with power near the end of his career, when they were walking him like crazy, and he was winning National League batting titles with a 350 batting average. I mean, the guy was incredible. I went to Mike Murphy, who was the longtime Giants clubhouse guy, and I asked him about the sizes of Bonds' caps, because there was that myth about Bonds' head getting bigger because he was doing steroids. And Murphy, who I don't think would lie, gave me a year-to-year size of his cap for all the years he was with the Giants, and there was barely any fluctuation in the size of his cap. I mean, I think Barry was suspected of doing a lot of things that he didn't do. I think he did do some things, but he was among most players in the sport, players who you expected to do it, probably didn't do it, people who you didn't suspect, middle infielders who wanted a big contract were doing it for a couple of years so they could get the contract and then stop doing it. Obviously, pitchers did it, so you don't know who you were facing. Clemens is one of them who was suspected of doing it. So to me, it was just all put it into the the wash when you decide of what you're going to do with the steroid candidates. Just like A-Rod now. I mean, A-Rod as a young player might have been the best player I've ever seen when he was with Seattle. I remember one series against the Yankees in the early 2000s when he was on the field, maybe it was 2000, and he was the most complete player I've ever seen. And he finished his career with over 600 home runs, over 2,000 runs scored and RBIs, and 3,000 base hits. And he's the only other guy in baseball history to do that besides Hank Aaron. He admitted he did steroids. He got caught up in the Florida thing. It's a non-analytical. He never failed a test. But, obviously that's one of the things you put into the mix when you decide whether you're going to vote for him or not. And so I just think what he did on the field overcame the stupidity of him having to do these drugs to make him better and use as a psychological crutch to make him feel like he was doing better. So with Bonds, I I think they stacked the Hall of Fame, by, the people, James Forbes Clark, who runs the Hall of Fame, who I love dearly, but I think she and the board, by making the qualification time on our ballot and shrank it from 15 years to 10 years in the middle of while all these steroid guys were on the ballot, I think that put them into a position where they, under the current system, they're never going to get into the Hall of Fame. I mean, you saw it this year in the Veterans Committee. I mean, we don't know how many votes Bonds got or Clemens got because they were in that group of players who got under 4, and they're not transparent about their own ballot, and they won't tell us who got what under 4. So Bonds could have gotten no votes on this ballot, going down from 67% on our ballot last year. Last year he was 50 some odd votes, or maybe a little bit more, 75 votes away, and this year he was 12 votes away, and no matter what the makeup of this ballot's going to be, he's just not going to get in under the system. None of these guys are, and that's really where the Hall wants it. They don't want any of these guys in the Hall. They don't want Pete in the Hall. They don't want Barry or Clemens in the Hall. And I think what will happen ultimately is that, when Jane is in her 70s, she doesn't have any heirs. She has told me that they have a setup of, a committee that will run the Hall when she's gone. And I think once she's gone and you get more enlightened leadership of the Hall, and it's not just the Forbes family who's in control of that, and half the museums in town, and the conservancy that runs around the lake, you're going to have a different situation, and they'll have a committee, if it's the same format, just like the Negro League committee, and they'll evaluate all the steroid guys, and they'll put them in. But I think that's going to be long after I'm gone, Barry's gone. I don't think it's going to be anytime soon. You're looking at 15, 20 years down the road for that to happen, unless something happens to Jane, in the next few years. But her father lived a long time. Her grandfather, who founded the Hall, lived a long time. I suspect she's going to be in control of the Hall for a long time. And it's her nonprofit, and they run it with the way they want to. And, far be it from me to tell them what to do.
I mean, do you think Bonds and Clemens, and to an extent A-Rod, are kind of getting kind of held out because they were just the best of the era, and so it's easy to point at them and say, these guys are suspected? Because there's plenty of guys in right now that have been suspected, and then you have the leadership that oversaw the steroid era. You had Selig and LaRussa and Joe Torre. All those guys are in. So are Bonds, Clemens, and A-Rod just kind of facing the penalty because they were the best to do it, so they get the records, and then the other guys get the Hall of Fame?
Can I curse on this podcast?
Go for it.
Absolutely.
We'd want nothing more.
Okay. They were dicks. Bonds, Clemens, and A-Rod were dicks. They're still dicks. I had a great relationship with Bonds, but that doesn't mean he was dickish to me over the course of time. He was. I just never held it against him, and we always, had good talks, good times. But that's not the way his relationship was with the rest of the writers. A-Rod's a phony. Clemens was also very dickish up until his final years in the league. And, I think that writers are human. If you gave them the benefit of the doubt and you acted, with some sort of cordiality to them, they might have had a better chance of getting into the Hall. But I think what they've done is, between, my cohorts, what they did was, because Bonds was the way he was, and the other two guys were the way they were, they use them as an example. Plus, there's the pressure from fans who don't want him in, from people in the Hall who don't want him in, from the owners who used them up and paid them until they couldn't play anymore. and now are left it for us to throw these guys under the bus. And I'll, digress a little bit here. When it hit home to me was about 5 years ago, maybe a little bit more, when Yasmani Grandal and a couple of other guys, Nelson Cruz, were given big contracts as free agents. Both of those guys were suspended, 50 games for drug use. When they were signed by, I think it was the White Sox and the Twins, respectively, at that time, it meant that the owners didn't give two shits about what they did. As long as they could be productive for them and help them win, they'd sign them. Once they were not anymore, they'd throw them to the wolves and then backdoor it that they shouldn't be recognized in the Hall of Fame because of what they did. The owners took advantage of this. I mean, look, I'll say, since I was so close to it, I was there in San Francisco almost every day the last 5 years of Barry's career, covering him from his 700th homer on through Ruth and Aaron. I knew Peter McGowan really well. I saw the way Barry treated Peter McGowan. When they tried to get McGowan tried to get him to do the simplest things, one of them being his last year was 2007. That was the year he broke Aaron's record. The Giants hosted the All-Star game. I think it was that year. Okay. They had the home run derby. McGowan went personally to Bonds and asked him to represent the Giants in the home run derby in San Francisco. Bonds told him to go to hell, and he went to a party that he hosted in the China Basin District while the home run derby was going on. I think that was the last straw. I've talked to McGowan about it before he died. He didn't actually, support the theory. He said it was just one of the things. But I mean, those are the things that Barry did, which caused him to be extremely disliked from all errands, all angles, from from the writers who covered, from some of his teammates. Some of his teammates loved him. Some of his teammates hated him. From the opposition, especially. I mean, from the Major League Baseball to the top. I mean, you had a guy here who was an outstanding player and a cantankerous individual who was passing the record of a guy the commissioner loved. And Hank Aaron, for my money, as a right-handed hitter, is probably the best hitter of all time because his numbers are just far and away and far and above everybody else's. If you look at the amount of home runs, the amount of hits, the amount of runs scored and RBIs, the slugging percentage, the OPS and OPS plus. I mean, Aaron was just way up there, and he was a beloved figure. Plus, he went through what he went through to break Ruth's record. And so he was good friends with Bud. I think Bud's worst day was the day Barry passed him on the all-time list. And there was nothing he could do about it. So you throw all of this together, and then Bonds wanted to play in 2008, and they blackballed him out of the league. I mean, he literally went to every team in 2008 and 2009 and said, I'll play for the minimum, which I think was $500,000 then. And then he knew he could probably go. There was a clause in the basic agreement which allowed him to sue for treble damages. And some guys made their money back doing that because of collusion. And if he could prove collusion, he would have made his money back. And every club in Major League Baseball said no, including the A's, who could have really used him. And Billy Beane wanted him, but Lou Wolf wouldn't let him sign him. So, I mean, the Barry story is laced with so many angles, and like the Big Lebowski, it's like what have yous, and there's a lot of ins and outs there. I mean, it's a very complicated story, and there's a lot of reasons why Barry's in the situation he's in, and Barry knows it. So Again, on your co-host question, I just don't think there's going to be any room for Barry to get into the Hall of Fame anytime in the near future.
Yeah, and kind of pivoting here to your current ballot and the ballot you just submitted, you have Todd Helton, Andy Pettit, Alex Rodriguez, Scott Rolen. So those are the four names that you casted on this ballot. And one guy that I want to talk about, and Tyler and I are gonna probably throw a few names at you, maybe that you left off or that you voted for. But one of the guys that I want to mention is Gary Sheffield. And Sheffield, I think, there's a few ways you could look at it. There's obviously he was not a great defender, played in the National League his entire career, did not get a chance to DH. Maybe if he was a DH, it would be different. But I think he played on so many teams, it's hard to kind of remember his. I think his legacy is a little bit skewed in that people don't identify him with one certain team. I think it's kind of the Fred McGriff effect to some extent. But Sheffield, he also has the Balco ties a little bit. What are your kind of thoughts on Sheffield? Because I know you voted for him once, if I'm not mistaken. Why not anymore?
I just think Sheffield is the whole, I never voted for McGriff. I love McGriff. He's a great guy. I covered both of them when they were with the Padres. Uh, I just think they were both the whole of the very good. They're just not Hall of Fame players as far as I'm concerned. Would it matter to me if either of them got into the Hall of Fame? No, just like McGriff. I never voted for him. He got maybe what 39% on our ballot the 10 years he was on our ballot. The 11th year he gets voted in unanimously by the Veterans Committee. I think that kind of undermines our vote. It doesn't really make much sense. Why have him on the ballot for so many years? This is the way we vote. We view it. Sometimes we miss. I don't think we missed on McGriff. I think he's a very good player. I don't think he's a Hall of Fame player. Now, do I care that he's in the Hall? No. Do I care that Harold Baines is in the Hall? No. But Sheffield and Baines are very similar, where the two of them played for a lot of franchises. And it just happened that on a committee one year, a 16-person committee, that LaRussa and Reinsdorf were on that committee, and they held a lot of sway in the room, and they got votes for Harold Baines. Do I think Harold Baines belongs in the Hall of Fame? No. Do I have any problem with him being in the Hall of Fame? I don't. Like I said right off the top of the show, the ballot this year was brutal. There's nobody on that ballot. Even the four guys I vote for are all marginal for one reason or another, except maybe Pettit. And I'll tell you, Pettit had 254 wins, 19 in the playoffs. He was not the best pitcher on the Yankee staff any of the 5 years he was in the World Series, but he was an integral pitcher. And every time practically you turned around for Pettit, he wound up being a really important cog in the Yankees winning those World Series. That means a lot to me. And I'll say, I grew up in the Bronx, 10 minutes from Yankee Stadium. I've been a Yankee fan since my father took me to the original Yankee Stadium in 1960. I'm harder on them than anybody because of it. But, I will say, I think it's a misnomer that there are 7 Braves in the Hall of Fame from the teams that won one World Series in the 1990s. The Yankees won 5 World Series and 7 or 8 pennants, and they have two guys off that team in the Hall of Fame and Joe Torre. They've got Jeter and Mariano, and that's it. And Pettit and Posada didn't even get a sniff. And now you want to put Andrew Jones in too? I mean, really, enough is enough. I mean, they were all great guys. They're all great players, and I voted for all of them. I voted for Chipper. I voted for Smoltzy. I voted for Glavine. Certainly Maddox. I mean, the guy had 355 wins. I mean, these are all great players. But, Clemens would have been another guy, another Yankee in the Hall of Fame from that era who played on some of those World Series teams. and he had 354 wins, and what, 6 or 7 Cy Youngs. But he can't get in because there's an implied steroid use there. Never failed a drug test. Barry never failed a drug test. Both of them were exonerated for perjury about lying about their use, but they were exonerated. Those guys should be in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
And everything else afterwards really doesn't make much sense. Now, Gary Sheffield, come on.
Well, one thing that, and I do want to mention, we have a listener, Chris Cassetta, who also sent this in, and it was something that Steven and I were also curious on, and it kind of fits into, Sheffield being in the National League, never getting to DH, and Pettit, how he was used at times. With some of these new rules that are coming into play around baseball, and some of just the player usage, with platoons being heavy, heavier bullpen use where stars aren't going as deep, and then a lot of managers being more comfortable with maybe using their closer in the 7th or 8th if it's the highest leverage situation. How do you think some of these changes in the game are going to affect the Hall going into the future? Will it still be just the best of each era gets in, or will it kind of just even make for a smaller Hall, because do you think voters will stick to kind of the cumulative stats and the totals of a career?
Well, look, I'm 71 years old, and I've voted for 30 some odd years. If I vote for another 10 years, I'll be doing well. So some of these guys, I'm never even going to look at.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things with the rule changes is that, particularly with the shift, there's not one player in Major League Baseball who's played 1 inning without the shift. There's been a lot of managers and coaches who were around before the shift, but that's going to dramatically change the game more than anybody thinks. It's going to change the game. The game is going to be back to where a line drive up the middle is going to be a base hit, just like it was in the old days when guys used to regularly get 3,000 hits. I mean, when you can move people around the infield, and look, tracking players has never been a non-issue. I mean, I remember covering the Padres, and a manager named Greg Riddock, I sat down with him and he showed me what he was doing with the computer and these cards he had that showed where the spreads were for every hitter and where they hit the ball. And this was back in the 1990s. They shifted on Ted Williams. It's just that they didn't make it a regular. It was a tactic. It wasn't a strategy. So the strategy totally screwed the game. And and I've told this to managers. Torey Lovello, who I live in Phoenix, and he's really a nice guy, good manager, really one of my favorite people. And I told them, you guys are the reason why this was done, because you overused it. The extreme shifts with shortstops going back and forth and being exchanged between third basemen on different counts and different pitches, and you have people moving all over the field on every pitch. It just got crazy. That the Dodgers last year had, and I'm doing this off the top of my head, I wrote it at one point. I mean, they shifted on 7,000 pitches last year. And consequently, they had the best, defensive metric when it came to runs allowed, but it was only 58. They prevented 58 runs with 7,000 shifts. What does that do to the enjoyment of the entire game? So now getting back to your question about how do all these changes, affect the Hall of Fame? Okay, number one, as I told you, the last generation of players, 23 guys we voted in. If it wasn't for steroids, Bonds, McGuire, Clemens, Sosa, Palmiero, all those guys would have been in. It would have been about 30 players, if not more. In this era, from the people who are retiring and are on the or just retired on their way out now are over 10 years. You've got, Cabrera is going to get into the Hall of Fame. Pujols obviously is going to get into the Hall of Fame. I look at Sabathia with 3,000 strikeouts and 250 wins. He's on the ballot. He's going to get into the Hall of Fame, I think. He's on the ballot in 2025. Ichiro is certainly in the Hall of Fame in 2025. Beltre, I think, is in the Hall of Fame next year with 3,000 hits and the numbers he put up. And then, so that's it. It's like five guys among pitchers. Besides Sabathia, there are no other pitchers. There are no other closers that you will put in the Hall of Fame. I don't know when the next closer. That was always a hard one to judge anyway. And it slowly, the log jam on it got broken. First Fingers got in. He was a multiple. He had started for a while, but he made his bones as a closer. Then Gossage, who also started. Suter was the first guy who was put in who was a pure closer, and he had his career truncated by injuries. Obviously guys like Rivera and Hoffman who were the anomalies because they had 18 to 20-year careers doing the same thing, closing games, and their statistics are way beyond anybody else in history as far as saving games are concerned. So, but among the current group, I mean, is Kimbrel a Hall of Famer? I don't think so. Maybe Kenley Jansen, because he saved so many games for the Dodgers. Not Aroldis Chapman. So who's the next closer out of this group? And then when you look at the pitchers, you have to look at a whole other way of evaluating pitchers. I mean, when I started in the 90s, a starting pitcher didn't get in basically unless it didn't win 300 games. I mean, Cott didn't get in until recently on a veterans committee, and he had 280 some odd wins. And the reason that happened was he finished his career as a reliever. He was asked to relieve. He could have continued to close. I mean, he could have continued to start, but the managers asked him to relieve, and he did. So he lost a number of years as a starter where he could have had 300 wins. And if he had 300 wins, he would have been voted in that era. Tommy John's another one. He should have been voted into the Hall of Fame with 270, 280 wins. But, once you got through Randy Johnson, who was the last one, that statistic kind of went away. And now the only guy who has an absolute outside chance of doing it, if he stays healthy, is Verlander. And I've had long conversations with Verlander and Kershaw about, some on the record, some off the record, about it really concerns me as a Hall of Fame voter how you can't use the old stats. How do we get you into the Hall of Fame if somebody like Kershaw has less than 200 wins? Say his career ends tomorrow, and what does he have, 187 wins, something like that? And his career, as great as he's been, he's got his Cy Youngs, he's pitched no hitters, finally straightened himself out in 2020 and pitched decently in the postseason. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to, ERA plus, there's a lot of reasons to vote Kershaw into the Hall of Fame, but wins is not one of them. And I wrote a column a few years ago after talking to Kershaw that, really, he's a bubble guy for me. If his career had ended then, I don't know that I'd vote him into the Hall of Fame. Today, I think I would, because of what's happened to starting pitching. That's not his fault. It's not his fault that guys are not trained to go further than 6, 7 innings, and then they're at the getting a win is at the expense of some multiple relievers. Now it's not even just you pitch into the 8th and you have one closer, and if that you have a lights out closer, then you're going to get the win. I mean, it's obvious that the longer you pitch into a game, the better chance you have, the better your chance you have to get the win, better chance you have your team to get a win. The less pitchers you can put out there, the better. The more pitchers that go out there, there are more multiple chances of something happening in that game to lose that game. And so, Verlander's at 244. He's going to be 40. He just signed a couple of year contract with the Mets. He's had Tommy John surgery. He had a great year this year with the Astros. If he can win 15 to 20 games a year for the next 4 years, he might be the next 300 pitcher. And so, I mean, there's no question about Verlander. Verlander is in the Hall of Fame. But aside for that, who else among Scherzer is another guy he's around 200 wins. He's in the Schilling category. Schilling, 219 wins, 10 in the postseason. He was a great postseason pitcher, but he's been on the bubble for years because he just didn't put up the counting stats over the course of time in his career. So if you're not putting Schilling into the Hall of Fame, how are you putting Scherzer into the Hall of Fame? It depends on what these guys do for the rest of their career. So, I mean, I think it's, to answer your caller, or, whatever you want to call him, answer your question and that question, it's going to be very difficult. And the Hall of Fame is going to get smaller and smaller because of it.
And yeah, one thing we wanted to pivot to, we have a few more things here before we wrap up, was, Buster Posey also is going to appear on the ballot in the coming years. He just retired after the 2021 season. And then, of course, we're going to have Molina the next year come on the ballot. And Tylor and I were talking about it, and we keep on mentioning how we have a lot of Giants people that listen. But, yeah, Posey, he doesn't have the counting stats. But then again, historically, catchers, unless you're a guy like Mike Piazza or Pudge Rodriguez, who had a lot of hits and a lot of games caught, they don't necessarily, Johnny Bench, who had the big all-around numbers, it's hard to get into the Hall of Fame as a catcher, and there's very few catchers that, could come up at 21, 22 years old and make a difference right off the bat. A lot of them are late bloomers, getting it together at 28 years old. Posey's an interesting case. He's won everything there is to win in baseball: MVPs, comeback players, Rookie of the Years, World Series trophies, everything. And he kind of retired a little early. Maybe he had a few years left in him, went out on top, of course. Do you think, because there's a lot of people outside of San Francisco and the Bay Area that think maybe Posey is a borderline candidate, do you think those achievements and those awards mean anything in terms of voting for Posey as a possible candidate in the future?
I'm sorry, in that group of players that we talked about, I left Molina out. Yeah, Molina is a slam dunk. There's no doubt about that. And, personally, Posey is one of my favorite people and players of all time. And, and Joe Mauer is going to be on the ballot next year. And he had his career shortened too, much like Posey, because of bad knees. He didn't even catch those last few years. But he's the only American League catcher to ever win the batting title, and he did it a couple of times.
We'll see him next year, Mauer.
So, people have already asked me about Mauer. I will definitely vote for Mauer, and I will definitely vote for Posey if I'm still around when Posey gets on the ballot. I mean, I just saw the guy play every year, and I saw how he overcame the ankle injury in his second season, in the 2011 season. I mean, that was he played the rest of his career with pins and a plate in his leg. People don't realize that was a death-defying injury for a catcher. He could have been out of baseball very easily, but he came back and won Comeback Player of the Year, led the league in hitting, played for the 3 World Championships, did the Renaissance year in 2021, with Crawford and Belt. I mean, the drop off in the Giants from 2021 to 2022 had a lot to do with Posey not being there and Posey not being in the locker room to interface with the players and help Kapler. And Kapler even admitted that those 3 guys having the great years they had in 2021 out of nowhere, they kind of reminded me of the Yankee Core 4 in 2009 when, Pettit, Jeter, Mariano, and Posada all had really good years. They added Teixeira, they added Sapathia, they added a number of other players. They had Hideki Matsui. I mean, they added to the core, but those guys all had great years and they won the World Series in 2009. And then that was pretty much it. And so the Giants got one great more year out of those three guys. And Buster was the ringleader. And, with him too, like Mike Matheny before him, who played for the Giants, we talked at length. Matheny and I wrote about the amount of concussions that he had as a catcher and how it finally ran him out of the game. He just couldn't catch it. He couldn't play anymore because every time he got a foul tip on his mask, he'd have another concussion. I mean, God knows how many concussions Buster had during his career, and he played through it. I mean, there are extenuating circumstances up and down the line with Buster that you go beyond, the counting stats. And I saw every year of his career, up and down, in and out. There was nobody who was the pitching staff, aside for Lincecum, who didn't like pitching to him until Bochy finally said, "Look, you're doing shit. You're going to pitch to Posey. You guys work it out. I don't want to hear about it anymore." Basically every pitcher loved pitching to Posey. I don't know that there's any catcher besides maybe Torrey when he was a catcher, or Girardi, I think was very good. Even Bochy as a backup catcher was very good, working with pitchers. These guys, they're so important to the whole fabric of the team. And that pitching staff that the Giants had in those years, with the core of it, I mean, you could really say the same thing. I mean, Lincecum won everything. He had 2 no-hitters, 3 world championships, led the league in strikeouts, Cy Young awards, but he had 100 wins, and he's not going to make the Hall of Fame. And Matt Cain's on the ballot, and he's not going to make the Hall of Fame either. But the whole core to that pitching staff was Bochy and Posey. And, if there wasn't a team captain on the Giants, Posey he wasn't formally the captain, but he was the captain. And so when he goes on the ballot, I'm certainly voting for him for the Hall of Fame. Do I think he's going to get enough votes to get in? Probably not, because people weren't as close to it as I was. They didn't see him play as much as I was. I mean, really, he came up at the tail end after the Bonds era, and from 2010, they brought him and Bumgarner up in June of 2010, and the two guys just excelled for that team through the whole World Championship and playoff run. It was just really unbelievable how much he did for that team.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Obviously, as a Giants fan, I hope he gets in. I think, similar to you, I got to watch him play pretty much every night. So I feel like we kind of recognize the deserving career that he had. But, to kind of tie a bow on this Hall of Fame discussion, Barry, right now, Scott Rolen, who is on your ballot this year, he's the closest right now on the tracker to getting in. Do you think anyone will be on stage with Fred McGriff on induction day?
I don't. And, this is my problem with the tracker. People who are willing to announce their vote, it's only about a little bit more than a quarter of the total vote. And the people who hide behind their anonymity, the numbers always go down significantly once those people vote. And that's why the tracker is generally erroneous. It skews where the vote is really going. I mean, even if you saw last year, David Ortiz, through the transparent votes and on the tracker, was much higher than what he finally got when he got in. But he did get enough votes to get in. He went down, but he didn't go down, that much. But Bonds and Clemens every year, polled more votes on the tracker than they did when the overall ballot was finished. So I'm guessing that, Roland's vote count is going to go down. He needs 43, I think, or 42 more votes to make up from last year. That's a lot to make up in 1 year. Next year there'll be more competition on the ballot again. And I think people don't really understand how the whole Hall of Fame voting process works. And even though you might not vote for a guy in a particular year, or you might vote for them later on in the ballot, as things change, that's why it's not a 1 year ballot. That's why, you can make adjustments on your thinking. And a lot of it has to do with who's competitively on the ballot in a particular year. So this is a good year. If Rolen's going to get in, this would be his year. And I would go back to 2012 when the year before the steroid candidates came on the ballot. Barry Larkin was the only one who got in. And I really feel that if he had not gotten in 2012, he never would have gotten in. Because once he got bogged down in that ballot with all the steroid guys, there was just no room on the ballot anymore. This was the only year I voted for less than 10 guys since I don't know when, 2012, 2011. I never voted for 10 guys early on in my voting, but I could have used 12 and 13 slots on the ballot the last 10 years, most of the time. That's how chocked the ballot was, with good people and the steroid candidates. So I think Rolen gets close, but I don't think he gets in, and I don't think Helton gets in, and beyond that, it's just too many votes to make up. So I think Fred McGriff is the only one who stands up behind the Clark Center on Hall of Fame Sunday, July 23rd in Cooperstown.
So it will be a Fred McGriff weekend, according to Barry Bloom in July, and I think so too as well. I don't think anybody's going to get in. And you're right about the tracker. I mean, as of a day ago, I believe it was only 32.5% of the vote that was on there. So still a long ways to go. Of course, those private ballots carry a bulk of it. Barry, we really appreciate you coming on. This was a blast, and it was awesome getting to hear your thoughts on the Hall of Fame. Thanks for coming on.
You're welcome. Thanks, guys. It was a great interview. I really enjoyed it.
And of course, if you guys want, you guys could follow Mr. Barry Bloom on Twitter, and he's got a very unique username. It is at Boomski, BOOMSKIE. So go check it out. And of course, go check out all of his great columns and content on Sportico.com. Just recently wrote about the whole Trevor Bauer situation with the Dodgers and the Dodgers releasing their highly paid right-handed pitchers. So he's able to go anywhere now. So go check that out on Sportico.com, and go follow the podcast on Twitter at @shutdown_inning. And we're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you find your podcasts. Go check it out. Happy New Year, everybody, and see you next time.